Why didn't anyone tell me this was happening? Naomi whispered to the empty kitchen, her voice trembling as she pressed her hands against the cold marble countertop, trying to steady the sobs that escaped despite her best efforts. The late-night silence of the Moretti estate wrapped around her like a heavy blanket, but it offered no comfort. She had thought she could handle everything on her own, that keeping her grief hidden would protect her from being judged or dismissed, but tonight the weight of betrayal and helplessness had finally broken through. The fluorescent light above flickered faintly, casting long shadows across the gleaming countertops and polished oak cabinets, highlighting the meticulous order of a kitchen that had seen thousands of meals prepared, yet had never witnessed someone's heart laid bare until now. Naomi's chest heaved as she sank onto the floor, knees drawn up, curls falling into her eyes, her apron damp from tears she had tried to wipe away only to have them return relentlessly. Every breath felt tight, every heartbeat loud in the emptiness. She thought of her mother, lying sick in the hospital down the city streets, of the bills stacked neatly beside the bed that she had no way of paying, of the calls she had ignored for fear of revealing her weakness, and of the man she had trusted who had taken advantage of her vulnerability, leaving her with nothing but questions and guilt. A soft click behind her made her freeze, and before she could move, the door to the kitchen swung closed with a gentle but firm sound, the lock clicking into place. Naomi's eyes widened, head snapping up, expecting confrontation, scolding, or anger, but instead she met the steady gaze of Vincent Moretti, the man whose presence alone commanded the sprawling mansion and whose reputation for control and composure was legendary. His hands were relaxed at his sides, but his piercing blue eyes, calm yet intense, fixed on her with an attention that seemed to strip away all pretense. The usual stoicism in his expression was softened by an unspoken concern, and the air between them felt charged with a mixture of tension and protective care. He took a measured step. Closer, not imposing, but deliberate, his shadow stretching over the tiled floor toward her. Naomi swallowed, trying to form words, her throat tight, but before she could, Vincent's deep voice, low and steady, cut through the quiet. Who hurt you? The question was simple, devoid of judgment or accusation, yet carried a weight that made her heart flutter with both fear and relief. She blinked against the bright overhead light, the tears still streaking her cheeks, catching the glow like tiny prisms, and for the first time since the night had begun, she felt seen. Not for her mistakes, not for her failure to keep everything under control, but for the pain she had endured quietly, for the courage it took to survive this far. Her hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the counter, her knuckles white, and she found herself whispering fragments of the story she had locked away inside her. A story of deception, of lost money meant for her mother's care, of promises broken, of isolation in the heart of a world that moved around her while she bore the weight of it alone. Vincent remained silent, listening, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant ticking of a clock in the mansion's hallway. His gaze never wavered, steady and unwavering, giving her the space to let her emotions surface without shame. Naomi's breathing slowly began to even out, the tightness in her chest softening under the presence of someone who simply understood without needing to be told all the details. The kitchen, with its sparkling counters, hanging pots, and polished silverware, transformed from a place of solitude and despair into a sanctuary where her sorrow was met with quiet acknowledgement. Her tears became less frantic, more cleansing, each one a release of the burden she had carried alone, each one a small step toward relief she had not allowed herself in months. Vincent took a careful step closer again, not touching, not demanding, just being there, and Naomi, through the haze of her crying, felt the faintest shift in the room, a promise that her pain was valid, that someone powerful cared enough to notice, and that she would not have to face the consequences of betrayal alone. The moments stretched, a fragile bridge between despair and hope, and Naomi lifted her gaze, meeting his eyes fully for the first time that night, recognizing in them a depth of understanding and a willingness to act that made her heart pound and her soul take a tentative, cautious breath, the silence between them speaking volumes. The kind of unspoken communication that only occurs when two people exist in the same space with trust and empathy suspended delicately in the balance, and in that suspended silence, For the first time, Naomi began to believe that perhaps she would not have to bear this alone, that someone could care, that justice and protection were not distant fantasies, but tangible possibilities anchored in the presence of a man who had the power to make the world right in ways she had never imagined. Naomi sat on the cool marble floor, her back pressed against the smooth cabinet, trying to catch her breath as the intensity of her emotions slowly ebbed. She had always been careful to maintain composure, to hide every ounce of vulnerability behind a practiced calm. But tonight the weight of all she had carried alone had finally broken through, and there was no room left for pretense. Her mind wandered briefly to the countless mornings she had arrived before dawn, moving silently through the quiet hallways of the Moretti mansion, dusting, organizing, and preparing meals without drawing attention to herself, each act executed with precision and care so that no one would notice her presence beyond her work. Her body still trembled slightly from the flood of adrenaline that had accompanied her tears, and she clasped her hands tightly around her knees, seeking some small measure of stability in the midst of the storm inside her chest. Across from her, Vincent Moretti leaned casually against the edge of the island, the polished wood reflecting the soft overhead light. His tall frame relaxed, but his gaze unwavering, as if measuring every nuance of her expression, every flicker of movement, every subtle shift in posture. Naomi felt a strange mixture of apprehension and relief under the intensity of his attention, as if his presence alone was a shield against the chaos of the world beyond these walls. She had learned over the past 6 months to read the cues of the mansion, to anticipate the expectations and unspoken rules that governed the flow of life here, yet nothing had prepared her for the raw immediacy of being observed while so completely exposed, and she felt a rush of vulnerability that made her cheeks flush and her palms sweat. Vincent did not speak for several long moments, allowing the silence to stretch and wrap around them like a gentle embrace, giving Naomi the space to recover, to draw herself together without feeling rushed or pressured. She could hear the faint ticking of a wall clock in the hall beyond the kitchen, the distant hum of the refrigerator, and the soft echo of her own breathing, all magnified in the stillness of the night. Slowly, she lowered her hands from her knees, letting them rest on the floor, and met his gaze, searching for a hint of judgment, an indication that she would be dismissed or criticized for allowing herself this moment of weakness. Instead, she found only quiet attentiveness, a steady focus that seemed to acknowledge her pain without diminishing it, a presence that conveyed understanding without words. Naomi's thoughts drifted to the life she had outside these walls, to her mother, to the endless responsibilities she carried silently, to the constant pressure of maintaining dignity in a world that often overlooked her efforts. She realized, in that suspended moment, that she had been holding herself to impossible standards, striving for perfection in every task, every gesture, every interaction, fearing that any slip might result in harsh consequences, judgment, or indifference. Vincent's eyes remained fixed on her, his posture relaxed but his attention absolute, and she began to sense that this was not a moment of confrontation, nor a lesson in obedience or restraint, but a rare instance in which someone powerful was simply present with her, witnessing the fullness of her humanity without seeking to exploit or dominate it. Naomi drew a deep breath, feeling the tightness in her chest gradually loosen, the storm inside her beginning to settle, and she allowed herself a small, tentative exhale that carried with it a sense of relief and the faintest glimmer of hope. The kitchen, with its gleaming counters, neatly arranged utensils, and the faint scent of herbs lingering in the air, transformed from a place of solitary work into a space where her emotions were seen and acknowledged, where her vulnerability did not result in dismissal or scorn, but in understanding. Vincent remained a quiet presence, the soft lines of his face illuminated by the warm overhead light, his attention unwavering yet non-intrusive, and Naomi felt, perhaps for the first time in many nights, that she was not entirely alone in her struggles. She straightened slightly, brushing a curl from her forehead, and felt the first real sense of connection that had eluded her throughout her years of careful endurance. In the stillness of the kitchen, under the soft glow of the overhead lights, she realized that this brief encounter, this unspoken acknowledgement of her pain, had already begun to lift a weight she had carried for far too long, allowing her to breathe more freely, to consider, even if only in fragments, that help, compassion, and understanding might exist even in the places she had thought were governed solely by power and expectation. The silence lingered between them long after Naomi's breathing had steadied, and for a moment neither of them seemed willing to disturb it. Vincent finally pushed away from the kitchen island and walked toward the sink, reaching for a glass. The movement was simple, ordinary even, yet Naomi found herself watching him with quiet curiosity. Men like Vincent Moretti did not concern themselves with the private struggles of people like her. At least that was what she had always believed. He filled the glass with water and returned, placing it gently on the counter beside her. "Drink," he said softly. Naomi hesitated before accepting it. Her fingers wrapped around the cool glass, and she took a small sip. The water soothed her dry throat, but it did little to calm the uneasiness building inside her. She was not accustomed to kindness without conditions. Throughout her life, every favor had come with expectations. Every helping hand eventually demanded something in return. Even now, a part of her waited for the conversation to shift, for questions she could not answer, for obligations she could not fulfill. But none came. Vincent simply sat down in one of the kitchen chairs across from her. Not behind a desk, not standing over her, just sitting. Equal distance, equal eye level. Naomi noticed the detail immediately. It was the kind of thing most people would never think about, yet somehow it mattered. The mansion was filled with symbols of hierarchy. Staff entrances, separate dining areas, unspoken rules that everyone understood. Yet tonight those invisible lines seemed strangely absent. Vincent rested his forearms on the table and studied her quietly. "You have worked here 6 months. Naomi nodded. "Yes, sir. And in 6 months you have never been late." She blinked. "I try not to be. You never complain." "There is nothing to complain about." A faint expression touched the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. More like disbelief. "That is not true." Naomi lowered her gaze. The truth was that there had been plenty to complain about. Long shifts, endless worry, hospital visits squeezed between work schedules, sleepless nights spent calculating bills. But she had learned years ago that complaining changed nothing. It only made people uncomfortable. Vincent leaned back slightly. "You know what I noticed about you?" Naomi looked up cautiously. "No, sir. You always make coffee for everyone else before making any for yourself." She stared at him, surprised. Out of everything he could have observed, she never expected that. "That is just being polite." "No." His voice remained calm. "It is a habit." Naomi looked away again. The words landed harder than she expected. Because he was right. Taking care of others had become automatic. Her mother, her younger brother, co-workers, friends, strangers, anyone except herself. Somewhere along the way she had stopped believing her own needs mattered. The realization sat heavily in her chest. Vincent's gaze softened slightly. "People do not break overnight, Naomi." Her eyes lifted toward him. "What do you mean?" He folded his hands together. "I mean nobody ends up crying alone in a kitchen because of one bad day." The words settled into the room like a truth she could not escape. Naomi felt her throat tighten again. He was seeing pieces of her she had spent years hiding. Not because he was investigating. Not because he was suspicious. Because he was paying attention. Outside the tall kitchen windows, the city lights shimmered against the darkness, tiny points of gold stretching toward the horizon. Inside, the warmth of the room felt different now. Less like a workplace, more like a refuge. Naomi stared down at the engagement ring resting quietly in her apron pocket. She had not even realized she was touching it until her fingers tightened around the small circle of metal. Vincent noticed the movement instantly. His eyes shifted toward her hand, then toward the pocket. He said nothing, but Naomi could feel the question forming. The silence returned, heavier this time. Slowly, reluctantly, she reached into her pocket and pulled the ring into the light. It gleamed beneath the kitchen fixture for only a second before she placed it on the table between them. Vincent's eyes settled on it. The room went completely still. Neither of them spoke. But Naomi knew that the moment that small ring touched the table, everything was about to change. Naomi took a shallow breath and slowly placed the small engagement ring flat on the marble countertop, her fingers lingering near it as if she could absorb courage through touch alone. She looked up at Vincent, whose eyes remained steady, reflecting both curiosity and patience, a rare combination that unsettled and comforted her at the same time. For months, she had carried the weight of disappointment, betrayal, and worry for her mother, and now, finally, someone in this house seemed to recognize the depth of her struggle without demanding explanations she was not ready to give. Vincent leaned back slightly in the chair, the soft light glinting off his dark suit, and allowed the moment to stretch, giving Naomi the space to gather herself and decide how much to reveal. Her voice trembled, barely audible at first, when she spoke, explaining that the ring had belonged to someone she had trusted, someone who had promised support for her family, but had instead vanished with what little financial security they had managed to maintain. She described her mother's illness, the bills piling up, the uncertainty that had haunted every step she took, and the silent nights spent worrying about how to keep things afloat without collapsing under the pressure. As she spoke, her hands twisted nervously in her lap, and Vincent watched without interruption, his face unreadable, yet every subtle movement of his body suggested a careful assessment, a quiet empathy that did not patronize or minimize her pain. Naomi felt the knot in her chest loosen slightly, the tension of carrying everything alone beginning to ease in the presence of someone who was listening, truly listening, without judgment or expectation. The hum of the refrigerator and the faint creak of the mansion settling in the cool night air were the only other sounds, and each small noise seemed magnified against the silence that had grown between them, giving weight to every word, every pause. Finally, Naomi exhaled, her eyes meeting Vincent's directly for the first time since he had entered the kitchen, and she saw an almost imperceptible change in his expression, a subtle acknowledgement that her struggles were real, that her fear and pain were valid, and that she was not alone. Vincent's voice broke the silence gently, asking questions not to interrogate, but to understand, details about her family, about the sequence of events that had led to her distress, about what she had feared most in recent days. Naomi answered cautiously, revealing only what she could bear to disclose, yet even partial truths seemed sufficient for him to grasp the gravity of her situation. The kitchen, with its polished counters, gleaming utensils, and soft overhead lighting, had transformed from a place of ordinary work into a quiet stage for honesty and connection, the kind of rare space where vulnerability could be met with calm acknowledgement rather than dismissal. Vincent shifted slightly, reaching for a nearby notepad, but only to make a subtle note, an internal acknowledgement of the circumstances rather than a record of judgment, and Naomi felt a flicker of hope that she had not experienced in months. The room remained calm, the air filled with a quiet energy that spoke louder than words, a sense that actions would follow understanding, that someone capable of influence and authority was aware of her predicament, and that her pain had been registered in a space where it might finally lead to resolution. Naomi's hands rested on the countertop, the ring still in front of her, and she allowed herself a long, steady breath, feeling a cautious sense of relief, a delicate hope that the night might end with some measure of support rather than continued isolation. Outside the tall windows, the city lights shimmered against the darkness, but inside the kitchen, in this rare moment of attention and empathy, the world narrowed to the shared space between her and Vincent, a place where trust was beginning to take root and where she could imagine, even if only briefly, that her situation might change for the better. Vincent leaned back slightly, his eyes never leaving Naomi as she carefully folded her hands together, the ring still resting on the countertop between them, and for the first time, the silence felt less heavy, more contemplative than tense. He allowed a small moment to pass, letting the weight of the night settle, and then spoke softly, his voice calm but deliberate. "Tell me about him." Naomi's gaze dropped to her lap, and she hesitated, unsure if she could recount the betrayal without unraveling further, yet something in the steadiness of Vincent's presence gave her courage to continue. She described the man she had trusted, how he had promised to help her family, the way he had taken advantage of her patience and reliance, leaving her with nothing but mounting worry and uncertainty. Her words were quiet, but each one carried the weight of countless nights spent planning, hoping, and fearing, a burden she had carried alone until this moment. Vincent listened without interruption, absorbing the details with measured attention, nodding occasionally, but never expressing impatience or judgment, his posture relaxed yet commanding, a presence that demanded both respect and allowed vulnerability to exist without consequence. Naomi's chest tightened as she spoke, her voice catching with emotion, and Vincent shifted slightly closer, just enough to show attentiveness without imposing, his hands resting calmly on the edge of the countertop. He asked questions gently, seeking clarity, not confrontation. When the man had betrayed her trust, what promises had been broken, how long she had endured this alone, and what fears had grown in the shadows of her day-to-day life. Naomi answered with honesty, her voice steadier than she expected, each revelation a quiet unburdening of the tension she had carried. The kitchen, illuminated by the soft glow of overhead lights reflecting off polished marble, felt transformed, a space of quiet understanding rather than a mere workplace. She noticed the way Vincent's expression softened when she spoke of her mother, a vulnerability mirrored in his eyes that she had never seen before, and it made the weight of her experience feel acknowledged rather than dismissed. The small details mattered, the slight tilt of his head, the way his gaze followed her hands as they rested in her lap, the patience in the way he allowed her to tell her story without interruption. Naomi realized she was experiencing something she had not in months, perhaps years, a sense of being truly seen, not for her mistakes, not for the way she had hidden her struggles, but for the resilience and care that had carried her through countless challenges. Vincent remained quiet for several moments, allowing the gravity of her account to settle between them. The only sounds the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of the wall clock. He finally spoke again, his words precise, measured, and considerate. No one should bear this alone. You did not deserve to face this by yourself. Naomi felt a small, tentative relief rise within her chest, a weight lifting that she had not anticipated, and for the first time that night, she allowed herself a brief, unguarded smile. The simple acknowledgement, the recognition that her struggle was valid and witnessed, provided a fragile but genuine sense of comfort. The city lights outside the kitchen windows twinkled softly against the darkness, yet inside, the warmth of the kitchen and the attentiveness of Vincent made the world feel narrower, safer, and more manageable. Naomi straightened slightly, exhaling slowly, her shoulders relaxing as the tension in her chest eased, and for a fleeting moment, the mansion, with all its hierarchy and rules, felt like a place where she might be supported rather than simply observed, a space where her honesty and vulnerability could exist without immediate consequence, and where she could imagine that some measure of justice, or at least acknowledgement, might follow. The conversation ended shortly before midnight, but the effect it had on Vincent lingered long after Naomi had quietly returned to her room. The mansion fell silent again, its grand hallways empty and still beneath the glow of dim wall sconces, yet Vincent remained awake. He sat alone in his private study overlooking the Chicago skyline, a room lined with dark wood shelves and floor-to-ceiling windows that revealed thousands of distant city lights. On the corner of his desk rested a single object he could not stop thinking about, the small engagement ring Naomi had left behind when she rushed from the kitchen. Most people would have forgotten the conversation by morning. Vincent Moretti was not most people. He turned the ring slowly between his fingers, replaying every word Naomi had spoken, every hesitation, every detail she had tried to minimize. What bothered him was not the money. It was the pattern, the way she blamed herself, the way she seemed more worried about disappointing others than protecting herself. People who had been treated fairly did not carry that kind of guilt. At 1:30 in the morning, Vincent picked up his phone and made a call. The conversation lasted less than 60 seconds. He gave no explanations and asked no unnecessary questions. By sunrise, several discreet inquiries had already begun. Meanwhile, Naomi woke before dawn as she always did. She dressed quietly, tied her apron, and moved through the mansion with the same careful professionalism she had shown every day for 6 months. She expected embarrassment. She expected awkwardness. She expected Vincent to pretend the previous night had never happened. Instead, she found a fresh cup of coffee waiting on a kitchen counter beside a handwritten note containing only 3 words. "Drink this first." Naomi stared at the note for several seconds. No signature was necessary. A faint smile appeared before she quickly tucked the paper into her apron pocket. Across the city, information continued to surface. financial records, business registrations, public documents, details hidden beneath layers of appearances. Vincent reviewed each report personally throughout the morning. The deeper he looked, the less he liked what he found. Naomi had only told part of the story because she believed the rest was too embarrassing to share. The reality was far worse than she realized. The man she trusted had not simply walked away. He had been building a carefully constructed illusion for months, making promises he never intended to keep while presenting himself as someone honorable and dependable. Vincent closed one file and opened another. His jaw tightened slightly. For the first time since meeting Naomi, genuine disappointment crossed his face. Not because of what had happened, but because she had endured it alone. By late afternoon, Vincent stood in front of the study windows with his hands folded behind his back. The city stretched endlessly below him, but his attention remained fixed on a single thought. Naomi believed she had lost everything. She believed the chapter was over. What she did not know was that the truth was finally beginning to surface. Downstairs, she continued her work, completely unaware that events had already been set in motion. She moved through the mansion carrying fresh linens, organizing shelves, and helping prepare dinner as though life had returned to normal. Yet several times throughout the day, she caught Vincent observing her from a distance. Not in a way that felt intimidating, more like someone making a decision. And each time their eyes met, he offered the slightest nod before continuing on his way. Naomi could not understand it. But somewhere deep inside, beneath the worry and exhaustion, a fragile feeling had begun to grow. For the first time in months, she no longer felt invisible. Late in the afternoon, the mansion's main hall hummed with quiet activity as staff moved about their duties, but Naomi felt a subtle tension that she could not explain. Vincent had disappeared after breakfast, leaving only a note instructing her to continue her work as usual, yet the memory of the previous night lingered in her mind. Each glance toward the staircase or the kitchen doorway carrying the possibility that he might appear again unexpectedly. She moved carefully through the wide hallways, adjusting silverware and polishing glassware with practiced precision. Yet every step seemed heavier than usual, as though the knowledge that someone was acting on her behalf had shifted the weight of responsibility onto her shoulders in a new and uncertain way. Around midday, Vincent returned, not to confront, not to question, but to observe and plan. From the windowed study overlooking the garden, he watched quietly as a series of discreet inquiries unfolded. Each phone call, each subtle instruction to trusted associates ensuring that the man who had deceived Naomi could be located and confronted without her direct involvement. By early evening, a plan had been set into motion, yet Naomi remained unaware, diligently completing her tasks while fragments of her life outside the mansion pressed in. Her mother's hospital room, the bills stacked neatly beside the bed, the countless unanswered calls. Vincent's approach was methodical. He preferred to act with precision and foresight rather than sudden moves that might alert her adversary or cause unnecessary alarm. Staff members noticed only his calm presence in the background, his watchful eye catching minor irregularities in the household routines, yet no one suspected the underlying motive driving each step. As twilight approached, Naomi found herself in the kitchen once more, arranging freshly prepared ingredients for the evening meal, her thoughts wandering to the engagement ring resting safely in her apron pocket. Her fingers brushed against it unconsciously, a reminder of the trust and vulnerability she had revealed. The soft glow of the chandeliers reflected off polished counters and copper pots, creating an almost serene atmosphere, belying the quiet urgency of Vincent's maneuvers elsewhere in the mansion. Outside, the city lights began to sparkle against the darkening sky, yet inside, time seemed to stretch, moments elongated as the mansion itself held its breath in anticipation. Vincent moved among the quiet spaces of the house, making subtle inquiries, checking records, and confirming details with trusted aides, all the while maintaining the appearance of normalcy for Naomi, allowing her to complete her day without interruption or stress beyond her ordinary duties. Naomi continued to work, unaware of the layers of observation and preparation unfolding around her, the meticulous care she took in arranging dishes and utensils reflecting her habitual attention to detail and sense of responsibility. She felt a quiet shift in the atmosphere, a subtle reassurance that the world beyond her immediate tasks was being managed, Yet she could not have imagined the scope of Vincent's efforts, the deliberate and careful orchestration to ensure that justice would be served without exposing her to further harm or anxiety. The evening shadows lengthened across the marble floors, and the kitchen, once a space of personal vulnerability, began to feel charged with anticipation, the unspoken promise of resolution hanging in the air like the faint aroma of freshly baked bread. Naomi adjusted her stance, straightening her back and smoothing her apron, feeling an unarticulated sense of relief that she could not yet name, a hope that the coming hours might bring answers, support, and the validation of her courage in a world that often overlooked the quiet resilience of people like her. In the distance, Vincent's silhouette moved through the study, his attention focused, deliberate, and unwavering, a quiet guardian ensuring that the consequences of deceit would be addressed and that Naomi's trust, recently extended, would not be misplaced. The evening unfolded with a quiet intensity as Vincent's plan reached its culmination. Across the city, the man who had betrayed Naomi and manipulated circumstances to his advantage was completely unaware of the scrutiny already cast upon him. Within the Moretti mansion, the staff continued their routines, unaware of the careful orchestration of events that would soon bring clarity and justice. Naomi moved through the kitchen and dining areas, her movements precise, her mind still lingering on the remnants of the previous night's revelations, unaware that the consequences of the man's actions were about to be revealed. At precisely 7 o'clock, Vincent entered the kitchen once more, a subtle shift in his posture signaling a readiness for what was to come. He placed a set of documents, letters, and bank statements neatly on the countertop, their presence deliberate, without explanation. Naomi's gaze was drawn to the papers, curiosity and apprehension mingling as she stepped closer, her fingers hovering near the edges. Vincent looked at her without speaking, a calm but commanding presence, waiting for her attention to settle fully on the evidence before her. Slowly, Naomi began to read, her eyes scanning the carefully organized details, transactions, correspondences, and confirmations that traced a trail she had not been aware existed, a trail of deception and deliberate betrayal. She realized, with a growing sense of clarity, that the extent of the wrongdoing was far greater than she had imagined. Yet she also recognized the precision with which Vincent had assembled the information, ensuring that truth and accountability would be evident without unnecessary confrontation. The kitchen lights reflected off polished counters and gleaming utensils, creating a calm backdrop that contrasted with the gravity of the discoveries being made. Naomi's heart raced as she took in the evidence, the documents confirming everything she had suspected, everything she had feared, yet presented in a way that felt controlled, deliberate, and fair. Vincent's presence was steady beside her, his hands resting lightly on the countertop, his eyes unwavering as Naomi absorbed the implications. Each piece of evidence told a story, not only of deceit and manipulation, but also of the careful planning required to bring resolution without creating further harm. Naomi's fingers traced the edges of the papers, and she looked up at Vincent, her eyes reflecting a mixture of shock, relief, and cautious gratitude. He nodded once, subtly, acknowledging the weight of what she had discovered and the burden she had carried in silence. The mansion, bathed in the soft glow of overhead lights, seemed to hold its breath, the usual sounds of distant traffic and muted appliances fading into a quiet stillness that focused entirely on the moment at hand. Naomi felt an unexpected sense of validation and safety, a rare comfort in the certainty that her truth had been recognized and that measures were in place to address the situation appropriately. Vincent remained silent, allowing the realization to settle fully, his quiet authority reinforcing the sense that the consequences of deceit would be addressed justly, without unnecessary spectacle or drama. The city outside continued its rhythm, yet within the kitchen, time seemed suspended, each moment weighted with the significance of accountability, understanding, and the subtle reassurance that the world had shifted slightly in her favor. Naomi exhaled, a soft, steady breath that carried away the tension she had held for so long, and as she glanced at Vincent, she saw the faintest acknowledgement of satisfaction, a quiet understanding that the first step toward resolution had been successfully achieved, and that she would no longer have to face the outcome of betrayal alone. 1 week later, the mansion felt different. Nothing had changed on the surface. The marble floors still gleamed beneath the morning sunlight. The hallways remained quiet and elegant. Staff members moved through their routines with the same professionalism as always. Yet for Naomi, something inside had shifted. The constant knot of anxiety that had lived in her chest for months was finally beginning to loosen. Her mother had received the treatment she needed. The overdue bills that once seemed impossible were no longer hanging over every waking thought. Most importantly, the truth had been uncovered. The burden she had carried alone had finally been seen. That morning, Naomi stood in the kitchen preparing breakfast ingredients when she noticed a familiar figure enter through the doorway. Vincent walked in without his usual entourage, dressed simply in a white shirt with the sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms. The early sunlight streamed through the tall windows behind him, casting long golden reflections across the polished counters. Naomi offered a polite smile. "Good morning, sir." Vincent nodded. "Good morning, Naomi." There was a calmness in his voice she had not noticed before. Not because he had changed, but because she was no longer afraid to hear it. He crossed the room and placed a large envelope on the counter between them. Naomi looked at it curiously. "What is this?" Vincent motioned toward it. "Open it." Her fingers hesitated before lifting the flap. Inside were hospital documents, updated payment records, and confirmation letters. Naomi stared at the papers in disbelief. Every outstanding balance related to her mother's care had been resolved. Every appointment scheduled. Every treatment secured. For several seconds, she could not speak. Her eyes moved across the pages again and again as if she feared they might disappear. Then she slowly looked up at Vincent. "You did this." Vincent shrugged slightly. "I made a few calls." Naomi felt her vision blur. She lowered her eyes, trying to compose herself, but tears gathered anyway. Not the tears of despair that had filled the kitchen that night. These were different. Softer. Lighter. The kind that appeared when someone finally allowed themselves to stop carrying the weight alone. Vincent watched quietly. Then he asked a question. "Why did you never ask for help?" Naomi froze. The answer came immediately, yet saying it aloud felt strangely difficult. She stared at the envelope for a long moment before speaking. "Because nobody ever stayed." The words settled into the silence. Vincent did not interrupt. Naomi continued softly. "People always promise. They always say they will help. Then life gets busy. Or they leave. Or they decide your problems are too much." Her voice trembled slightly. "Eventually you stop asking." The room grew still. Vincent looked at her. For several seconds, his expression unreadable. Then something softened in his eyes. Not pity. Not sympathy. Understanding. He glanced toward the window where sunlight illuminated the city beyond the estate walls. "That was their mistake," he said quietly. Naomi looked at him. Neither spoke after that. They simply stood there in the warm morning light, surrounded by the quiet hum of the kitchen. For the first time since arriving at the Moretti mansion, Naomi did not feel invisible. She felt valued, respected, seen. And as the silence settled comfortably between them, she realized something she would never forget. Sometimes dignity returns not through grand gestures, but through a single person who cares enough to ask a simple question and stay long enough to hear the answer. And that day, the world remembered what dignity looks like.